Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next instalment of A Bear Called Paddington. Now, as you know, I like bears, and I've got them all around me. I've got Big Ted, Orange Ted, Kerry Bear, Flower, Harley Bear, not forgetting Henry, and today I've got a new bear. He's rather cute, and his name is Floppy. And I really like him because he's really soft. So I'm going to put him up with Big Ted and Orange Ted there. Now, do you remember what happens in the story so far? Mrs. Brown and Judy had taken Paddington to Barkridge's to buy him some clothes, and he'd accidentally walked into the shop window and knocked down all of the display. But luckily, the manager was really happy because the crowd had loved watching him knock everything down. They thought he was really funny, and they'd come into the shop and bought lots of things. So the manager of the shop was really happy. And the book then talked about how Mrs. Bird would send Paddington out to the shops, and he really enjoyed going down the Portobello Road buying fruit and vegetables. The shopkeepers loved him. There was one particular shopkeeper that he really liked, Mr. Gruber. Now, Mr. Gruber's shop was really interesting. It sold lots of old things, furniture, pots, pans, medals. And Mr. Gruber and Paddington had become great friends and would spend lots of time sitting together, talking about South America and Peru and sharing cups of delicious cocoa. Okay, so let's get started on the book. Here it is. Paddington had always been interested in bright things, and he had consulted Mr. Gruber one morning on the subject of his Peruvian centavers, their coins. He had an idea in the back of his mind that if they were worth a lot of money, he could perhaps sell them and buy the Browns a present. £1 a week pocket money Mr. Brown gave him was nice, but by the time he'd bought some buns on a Saturday morning, there wasn't much left. After a great deal of consideration, Mr. Gruber had advised Paddington to keep the coins. "It's not always the brightest things that fetch the most money, Mr. Brown," he said. Mr. Gruber always called Paddington Mr. Brown, and it made Paddington feel very important. He had taken Paddington into the back of the shop where his desk was, and from a drawer he had taken a cardboard box full of old coins. They had been rather dirty and disappointing. "See these, Mr. Brown," he said. "These are what you call sovereigns. You wouldn't think they're very valuable to look at them, but they are. They're made of gold, and they're worth £50 each. What's more, £100 for an ounce. An ounce is an old type of measuring mass. We use grams now, don't we, boys and girls? But when this book was written, they used ounces. If you ever find any of those, you just bring them to me." One day, having weighed himself carefully on the scales, Paddington arrived round to Mr. Gruber, taking with him a piece of paper from his scrapbook, covered with mysterious calculations. After a big meal on a Sunday, Paddington had discovered he weighed nearly £16. Again, £16. Pounds is an old way of measuring mass. We use kilograms now for heavier things, don't we? After a big meal on a Sunday, Paddington had discovered he weighed nearly £16. That was, he looked at his piece of paper again as he neared Mr. Gruber's shop. That was nearly 260 ounces, which meant he was worth nearly £26,000. Mr. Gruber listened carefully to all that Paddington had to tell him, and then closed his eyes and thought for a moment. He was a kindly man, and he didn't want to disappoint Paddington. "I've no doubt," he said at last, "that you're worth that, but obviously a very valuable young bear. I know it. Mr. and Mrs. Brown know it. Mrs. Bird knows it. But do other people?" He looked at Paddington over his glasses. "Things aren't always what they seem in this world, Mr. Brown," he said sadly. Paddington sighed. "It was very disappointing. I wish they were," he said. "It would be nice." "Perhaps," said Mr. Gruber mysteriously. "Perhaps, but we shouldn't have any nice surprises then, should we?" He took Paddington into his shop, and after offering him a seat, he disappeared for a moment. When he returned, he was carrying a large picture of a boat. At least half of it was a boat. The other half seemed to be a picture of a lady in a large hat. There you are, he said proudly. That's what I mean by things not always being what they seem. I'd like your opinion on it, Mr. Brown. Paddington felt rather flattered, but also puzzled. The picture didn't seem to be one thing or another, and he said so. Ah, said Mr. Gruber delightedly. It isn't at the moment, but just you wait until I've cleaned it. I gave 50 pence for that picture years and years ago, when it was just a picture of a sailing ship. And what do you think? When I started to clean it the other day, all the paint began to come off, and I discovered there was another painting underneath. He looked around and lowered his voice. Nobody else knows, he whispered, but I think the one underneath is valuable. It may be what they call an old master. Seeing that Paddington still looked puzzled, he explained to him that in the old days, when artists ran short of money and couldn't afford any canvas to paint on, they sometimes painted on top of old pictures, and sometimes, very occasionally, they painted on top of pictures by artists who afterwards became famous and whose pictures were worth a lot of money. But as they had been painted over, no one knew anything about them. It all sounds very complicated, said Paddington thoughtfully. Mr. Gruber talked for a long time about painting, which was one of his favourite subjects, but Paddington, though he was usually interested in anything Mr. Gruber had to tell him, was hardly listening. Eventually, refusing Mr. Gruber's offer of a second cup of cocoa, he slipped down off his chair and began making his way home. He raised his hat automatically whenever anyone said good day to him, and there was a faraway expression in his eyes. Even the smell of buns from the bakery passed unheeded. Paddington had an idea. When he got home, he went upstairs to his room and lay in his bed for a long while staring up at the ceiling. He was up there so long that Mrs. Bird became quite worried and poked her head around the door to see if he was all right. Oh, quite all right, thank you, said Paddington. I'm just thinking. Mrs. Bird closed the door and hurried downstairs to tell the others. Her news had a mixed reception. I don't mind him just thinking, said Mrs. Brown with a worried expression on her face. It's when he actually thinks of something that the trouble starts. But she was in the middle of her housework and soon forgot the matter. Certainly, both she and Mrs. Bird were much too busy to notice the small figure of a bear creeping cautiously in the direction of Mr. Brown's shed a few minutes later. Nor did they see him return armed with a bottle of Mr. Brown's paint remover and a large pile of rags. Had they done so, they might have had a good cause to worry, and if Mrs. Brown had seen him creeping on tiptoe into the living room, closing the door carefully behind him, she wouldn't have had a moment's peace. Ooh, I wonder what he's going to do. What do you think? Fortunately, everyone was much too busy to notice any of these things. Even more fortunately, no one came into the living room for quite a long while, because Paddington was in a mess. Things hadn't gone at all according to his plan. He was beginning to wish he had listened more carefully to the things Mr. Gruber had said on the subject of cleaning paintings. To start with, even though he used almost half of the bottle of Mr. Brown's paint remover, the picture had only come off in patches. Secondly, and what was even worse, where it had come off, there was nothing underneath, only the white canvas. Paddington stood back and surveyed his handiwork. Originally, it had been a painting of a lake with a blue sky and several sailing boats dotted around. Now it looked like a storm at sea. All the boats had gone, the sky was a funny shade of grey, and half the lake had disappeared. Oh dear. What a good thing I found this old box of paints, he thought, as he stood back holding the end of the brush at paw's length and squinting at it as he'd once seen a real artist do. Holding the palette in his left paw, he squeezed some red paint onto it and he splodged it about with the brush. He looked nervously over his shoulder and then dabbed some more on the canvas. Paddington had found the paints in a cupboard under the stairs, a whole box of them. There were reds and greens and yellows and blues. In fact, there were so many different colours, it was difficult to know which to choose first. He wiped the brush carefully on his hat and tried another colour, and then another. It was all so interesting that he thought he would try a bit of each. and he very soon forgot the fact that he was supposed to be painting a picture. In fact, it was more of a design than a picture, with lines and circles and crosses of all different colours. Even Paddington was startled when he finally stepped back to examine it. Of the original picture, there was no trace at all. Rather sadly, he put the tubes of paint back in the box and wrapped the picture in a canvas bag, leaning it against the wall, exactly as he had found it. He decided reluctantly to have another try later on. Painting was fun while it lasted, but it was much more difficult than it had looked. He was very silent all through dinner that evening. He was so silent that several times Mrs. Brown asked him how he was, until eventually Paddington asked to be excused and went upstairs. "I do hope he's all right, Henry," she said after he'd gone. "He's hardly touched his dinner, and that's unlike him. And he seemed to have some funny red spots all over his face." "Crikey," said Jonathan, "red spots? I hope he's not given it to me. I hope he has given it to me, whatever it is. Then I shan't have to go to school." "Well, he's got green spots as well," said Judy. "I saw some green ones." "Green ones?" Even Mr. Brown looked worried. "I wonder if he's sickening for anything. If they're not gone in the morning, I'll send for the doctor." "He was so looking forward to going to the handicrafts exhibition too," said Mrs. Brown. "It'll be a shame if he has to stay in bed." "Do you think you'll win a prize with your painting, Dad?" asked Jonathan. "No one will be more surprised than your father if he does," replied Mrs. Brown. "He's never won a prize yet." "What is it, Daddy?" asked Judy. "Aren't you going to tell us?" "It's meant to be a surprise," said Mr. Brown modestly. "It took me a long time to do it. It's a paint from memory." Painting was one of Mr. Brown's hobbies, and once a year he entered a picture for a handicrafts exhibition which was held in Kensington, near where they lived. Several famous people came to judge the pictures, and there was a number of prizes. There was also lots of other competitors, and it was a sore point with Mr. Brown that he had never won anything, whereas twice Mrs. Brown had won first prize in the rug-making competition. "Anyway," he said, declaring the subject closed, "it's too late now. The man collected it this afternoon, so we shall see what we shall see. And we shall see it next time, because I'm going to leave it there." Now, I have put questions on a resource sheet that you can find on the website, but I'm going to read them to you now. You can stop and pause at any time, and you can answer them when you feel like it. Okay, question 1. Mr. Gruber asked for Paddington's opinion on a picture that he had bought a long time ago. Paddington felt flattered. What does flattered mean? Why did he feel flattered? Question 2. When Paddington arrived home, he went to his room to think. What do you think he was thinking about? Question 3. Why did Mrs. Brown have a worried expression on her face when she found out that Paddington was thinking? Right, number 4 is not a question at all, it's a challenge. Now, Paddington enjoyed experimenting with all the different coloured paints. He came up with his own design, he used crosses, circles, swirls. Now, your challenge is to create your own designs using as many colours as you can. You can use pencils, crayons, paints, anything you can find at home. I'd love to see some of your designs. Maybe you can post them in the comments below. Have a wonderful week, and I shall see you again next week for the next instalment of A Bear Called Paddington. Bye for now. Say goodbye to all the bears.